The weight of the gavel felt different in my hand that morning, heavier somehow. I adjusted my black robes and took a deep breath before entering the courtroom. 10 years of law school, clerkships, and working my way up through the legal system had led to this moment, my appointment as a Superior Court judge in Massachusetts. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Alexandra Harrington," the bailiff announced. I walked with measured steps to the bench, scanning the faces before me as I did every morning. The familiar routine of the courtroom usually brought me comfort. The structured proceedings, the pursuit of justice, the clear boundaries between right and wrong. "You may be seated," I said, my voice steady despite the flutter of nerves I still felt after 3 months on the bench. I glanced down at my docket. 5 cases today, beginning with Commonwealth v. Williams, a financial fraud case. I'd reviewed the file the night before. The defendant had allegedly swindled multiple investors out of their life savings through an elaborate Ponzi scheme before disappearing. He'd been apprehended trying to enter Canada with false identification. "Bring in the defendant," I instructed. The side door opened, and 2 officers escorted in a man in county-issued clothing. His head was bowed, his once dark hair now streaked with grey. Even before he raised his face, something about his posture sent a jolt of recognition through me. When he lifted his eyes to the bench, the courtroom around me seemed to fade away. Those eyes, I'd know them anywhere. The same eyes that had once looked into mine and promised forever. The same eyes that had turned cold the day he told me he wanted a divorce. Daniel, my ex-husband, the man who disappeared 10 years ago, the night before we were to sign our divorce papers. The man who'd emptied our joint accounts, sold our investments, and vanished with everything we'd built together during our 8-year marriage. My hands trembled slightly as I set down the file. No one in this courtroom knew our connection. I'd changed my name back to my maiden name after the divorce proceedings finally went through in his absence. I'd moved states, rebuilt my life piece by painful piece. "Daniel Williams," I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice remained. "You are charged with 23 counts of financial fraud, identity theft, and evading arrest. How do you plead?" His eyes widened as he recognized me, his face draining of color. His lawyer, noticing his client's sudden distress, placed a hand on his arm. "Not guilty, Your Honor," the lawyer answered for him, while Daniel continued to stare at me in shock. I should recuse myself. I knew that immediately. There was no way I could preside over this case with any semblance of impartiality. And yet, I hesitated. For years, I'd imagined what I would say if I ever saw him again, the questions I would ask. Why did you leave? Why did you take everything? Did any of it mean anything to you? "Your Honor," Daniel's lawyer prompted when I remained silent. I cleared my throat. "Bail is set at $5 million. Next appearance scheduled for 2 weeks from today for preliminary hearings." I struck the gavel perhaps harder than necessary. "Next case." As the officers led him away, Daniel looked back at me, a silent plea in his eyes that I refused to acknowledge. That night, I sat in my kitchen with a glass of wine untouched before me, my mind racing. The odds of this happening were astronomical. Of all the courtrooms in all the states, he walks into mine. I laughed bitterly at the cosmic joke. I thought about the day Daniel told me he wanted out of our marriage. It had come without warning, at least to me. We'd been having dinner at our favorite restaurant when he'd said calmly that he didn't love me anymore, that he wanted a divorce, that he'd already spoken to a lawyer. I remembered how the world had tilted on its axis, how the sounds of the restaurant had faded away as my heart thundered in my ears. 8 years together, gone in an instant. The next day, he'd promised to meet me at our lawyer's office to sign the papers and discuss the division of assets. But he never showed. When I returned home, I found closets emptied of his belongings. Calls to his phone went straight to voicemail, and when I checked our accounts, I discovered they'd been drained. $230,000, our savings, our investments, everything gone. The police had filed reports, investigators had searched, but Daniel had vanished completely, leaving me with nothing but crushing debt from the mortgage he'd refinanced without my knowledge and maxed out credit cards I hadn't even known existed. That betrayal had transformed me. I'd gone back to school, determined to understand how he'd managed to disappear so completely, how he'd manipulated our finances without my knowledge. I'd thrown myself into studying law, specializing in financial crimes. And now, here he was, Daniel Williams. Though that wasn't the name I'd known him by when we were married. He'd been Daniel Cahill then. How many identities had he worn since leaving me? I knew what I had to do. First thing tomorrow, I would recuse myself from the case and explain the conflict of interest to the chief judge. It was the only ethical choice. But as I finally took a sip of my wine, I couldn't help but feel that fate had delivered him to me for a reason. After 10 years of wondering, of rebuilding, of transforming my pain into purpose, I might finally get answers. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse early, intending to speak with Chief Judge Marshall before the day's proceedings began. But as I walked toward his chambers, my assistant intercepted me. "Judge Harrington, there's someone who insisted on seeing you." She looked uncomfortable. "A woman. She says it's about the Williams case. She's waiting in your chambers." Curious and slightly wary, I nodded and changed direction. When I opened the door to my private chambers, I found a woman with steel-grey hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing an expensive suit that couldn't quite disguise the frailty of her thin frame. "Judge Harrington," she said, rising from her seat, "my name is Eleanor Winters. I believe you have my daughter's husband in your courtroom." I gestured for her to sit back down as I closed the door behind me. "Mrs. Winters, court proceedings are public, but I can't discuss details of ongoing cases with—" "Please," she interrupted, her voice breaking slightly. "I'm not here about the case. I'm here about Melissa." I remained standing, maintaining professional distance. "Who is Melissa?" "My daughter, Daniel's wife." The words hit me like a physical blow. Wife. Of course he had remarried. Why wouldn't he? But something in her tone suggested there was more to this story. "Mrs. Winters, I still don't understand why you're here." Eleanor Winters reached into her purse and pulled out a photograph, extending it toward me. I took it reluctantly. The photo showed a smiling young woman with golden brown hair and warm eyes, standing next to Daniel. They were on a beach somewhere, looking happy. "This was taken 3 years ago," Eleanor said, 6 months before she disappeared. I sat down slowly, placing the photograph on my desk. Disappeared. Daniel told police they'd had an argument, that she'd stormed out and never came back. Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap. But Melissa would never abandon her son. Never. "They have a child?" My voice sounded distant even to my own ears. "Jacob, he's 5 now." Her eyes filled with tears. "Daniel has custody. I'm only allowed supervised visits because he convinced the court I was unstable after Melissa vanished, that my accusations were delusions of a grieving mother." I struggled to process this information. Daniel had remarried and had a child, and now his second wife was missing too. "Mrs. Winters, if you suspect foul play, you should speak with the police, not me." "I have. For 2 years I've begged them to investigate deeper, but Daniel is persuasive." She leaned forward. "When I saw his arrest on the news, I thought finally someone had caught him. But these charges, they're just about money. My daughter is still missing." A chill ran through me. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "Look into his past, Judge Harrington. Daniel Williams isn't his real name. Before he was Daniel Williams, before he was Daniel Cahill, he was Daniel Reeves." I froze. Daniel Cahill. She knew he had used that name. My name. How do you know about Daniel Cahill? I asked carefully. Because I've spent every moment since my daughter disappeared investigating him. She reached into her bag again and pulled out a folder. There's a pattern. He marries women with money or potential. Eventually, they either disappear or he does, with everything they have. I took the folder with numb fingers and opened it. Inside were newspaper clippings, printed social media posts, and handwritten notes detailing 3 different women's stories, all connected to the man I had known as my husband. After you, there was Patricia Bennett in Florida, Eleanor said, pointing to one of the articles. They were together for 2 years before her family reported her missing. Her car was found at a bus station. Police concluded she'd left voluntarily when they found surveillance footage of a woman matching her description boarding a bus. But her family insisted she would never leave without her dog. Eleanor's voice hardened. 6 months later, Daniel married my Melissa. I stared at the photograph of Patricia Bennett, a professional headshot of a woman with dark hair and a confident smile. There was no obvious resemblance between us, yet I felt a strange kinship with her. Mrs. Winters, I appreciate you bringing this to my attention, but I need to inform you that I cannot preside over Daniel's current case. She looked alarmed. Why not? I hesitated, then decided on honesty. Because I was married to him. I was Alexandra Cahill. Eleanor's eyes widened in recognition. You're the lawyer, the one who disappeared from the records. She shook her head in disbelief. He mentioned you once to Melissa, said his ex-wife was so destroyed by their divorce that she changed her name and moved away. The audacity of his lie made me clench my teeth. That's not what happened. I didn't think so. Eleanor stood, suddenly energized. This changes everything. You understand what he's capable of. You can help me. I cannot be involved in his case precisely because of our history, I explained. I'll be recusing myself today. But you're a judge, she pleaded. You have influence, connections. The police won't listen to me. I'm just a distraught mother in their eyes. I felt torn between professional ethics and the pull to help this woman who clearly believed her daughter had met with foul play, possibly at the hands of the same man who had betrayed me. The most I can do is recommend that the prosecutor's office look into these previous identities, I said finally. They might find connections to the current fraud charges. Eleanor looked disappointed but nodded. I understand your position, but please take the folder, read it, and if you change your mind about helping me. She placed a card on my desk with her contact information. After she left, I sat motionless, staring at the folder. Inside were the stories of women who, like me, had trusted Daniel. Unlike me, they hadn't been found. I had 15 minutes before court began, 15 minutes to decide how to proceed. The ethical path was clear. Recuse myself, hand over Eleanor's information to the prosecutor, and step away. But as I flipped through the meticulously gathered evidence, another path revealed itself. One that wasn't about revenge, but justice. Not just for me, but for Patricia, for Melissa, and who knew how many others. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for an old law school friend who now worked as an FBI agent specializing in serial fraud cases. Rick, it's Alex Harrington. I need a favor, and it can't wait. I explained the situation as concisely as possible, emphasizing the pattern of disappearances and financial fraud spanning multiple states. That's definitely within our jurisdiction, Rick said. Send me everything you have. I'll assign someone immediately. There's more, I added. The suspect is currently in custody here on state charges. I need him to remain in custody while you build your case. That shouldn't be a problem if the evidence is solid. Is there anything else I should know? I hesitated. Yes. I was one of his victims. I was married to him. There was a pause on the line. Alex, you know that complicates things. I know, I'm recusing myself from the state case today, but I needed you to understand the full picture. After hanging up, I gathered my robes in the folder. I would pass it to Rick immediately after court. As for Daniel's case, I would hand it off to another judge, one who could be impartial. As I entered the courtroom and took my place at the bench, I felt a strange sense of peace. For 10 years, I had wondered if I would ever know why Daniel had betrayed me, if I would ever see justice done. Now, I realized that my path to becoming a judge hadn't just been about understanding what had happened to me. It had prepared me to help others who had suffered similar fates. "Your Honor," my clerk whispered, "the FBI is here. They're requesting to speak with you regarding defendant Williams." I nodded, unsurprised by Rick's efficiency. "Tell them I'll see them in my chambers after I make my statement." I looked out at the courtroom, at the faces waiting for proceedings to begin. Somewhere among them was Daniel, unaware that his carefully constructed house of cards was about to collapse completely. "Before we begin today's proceedings," I announced, "I must recuse myself from the case of Commonwealth versus Williams due to a previously undisclosed conflict of interest. The case will be reassigned to Judge Reynolds, effective immediately." As murmurs spread through the courtroom, I caught sight of Daniel's face. He wasn't surprised by my recusal. He had likely expected it. What he didn't expect was what came next. "Additionally," I continued, "I have been informed that federal authorities wish to speak with the defendant regarding matters spanning multiple state jurisdictions. Bailiff, please ensure that the defendant remains in custody until federal agents can serve their warrant." Now Daniel's expression changed to one of alarm. He whispered urgently to his lawyer, who looked equally confused by this turn of events. As I struck the gavel one final time and rose to leave the courtroom, I allowed myself one last look at the man who had once been my husband. Our eyes met briefly across the crowded room. In that moment, I wasn't Alexandra Cahill, the abandoned wife. I wasn't even Judge Harrington, bound by judicial ethics. I was simply a woman who had transformed her pain into purpose, who had found a way to ensure that justice would be served, not just for me, but for all the women whose lives Daniel had destroyed. I turned and walked out of the courtroom with my head held high, ready to hand over everything I knew to the FBI. The past couldn't be changed, but the future, Daniel's future, was about to be decided by the very system I had dedicated my life to upholding. And there was a certain poetic justice in that. The FBI moved with remarkable efficiency. By the end of the day, Daniel had been transferred to federal custody, his bail hearing postponed indefinitely. I watched from a careful distance as the case unfolded, receiving occasional updates from Rick. "We've connected him to financial fraud in 7 states, Rick told me during one of our brief calls. "The pattern is consistent. Marriage, financial control, disappearance, either his or theirs." "And Melissa Winters?" I asked, unable to forget Eleanor's desperate face. "We're reopening the investigation. The local police overlooked some inconsistencies in Daniel's statement about the night she vanished. I threw myself into my other cases, maintaining professional distance from Daniel's prosecution. Yet each night, I found myself reviewing my own memories, searching for signs I might have missed. 3 weeks after Eleanor Winter's visit to my chambers, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. "Judge Harrington, this is Detective Sawyer with Massachusetts State Police." His voice was grave. "We've found something you should know about." 2 hours later, I stood at the edge of a construction site, watching as forensic technicians worked carefully around a concrete foundation that had been partially broken open. The half-built luxury home had been purchased through a shell corporation 2 years ago, a corporation the FBI had linked to Daniel. "The cadaver dogs alerted here," Detective Sawyer explained, keeping his voice low. "Ground-penetrating radar confirmed something beneath the concrete." "And you think it's Melissa Winters? Yes, the timing fits. Construction began shortly after her disappearance. I felt cold despite the warm spring day. Why tell me? I'm not family. The FBI suggested keeping you informed. He hesitated. And frankly, having a judge witness our process ensures everything is done by the book. This case can't afford any procedural errors. I nodded, understanding the unspoken message. If they found Melissa's body, they wanted the evidence to be unimpeachable. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the site, a technician called out. The detective and I approached as they carefully extracted something from the broken concrete. It wasn't a body. It was a metal box, a safe, small enough to be portable, but large enough to contain significant valuables. We need to process this properly, the detective said. Get a warrant to open it. I can call Judge Reynolds, I offered. He can issue one immediately. Within the hour, we had the warrant. The safe was transported to the police station, where a technician worked to open it without destroying potential evidence. When the door finally swung open, we found stacks of documents, passports, driver's licenses, birth certificates, all with different names but the same face. Daniel's face. Beneath them lay several flash drives, jewelry, and bundles of cash. This is a go bag, Detective Sawyer murmured. Everything needed for a quick disappearance. But what caught my eye was a leather-bound journal at the bottom of the safe. The detective, noticing my focus, carefully lifted it out using gloved hands. We'll need to review this as evidence, he said, but allowed me to see as he opened the first page. Inside, in neat handwriting I recognized immediately, was a detailed accounting of Daniel's life, not as a diary, but as a ledger. Names, dates, dollar amounts, women's names followed by assets acquired. My name was there. Patricia Bennett, Melissa Winters, and others I didn't recognize. He kept records, I whispered, feeling sick, like trophies. More like insurance, the detective replied. Names of offshore accounts, passwords, contacts for false documentation, everything he'd need to rebuild after each disappearance. The search continued through the night, but Melissa's body wasn't found at that location. However, the journal contained something potentially more valuable. GPS coordinates, each paired with initials. PB. Detective Sawyer read, pointing to one entry. Patricia Bennett? I nodded slowly, the horrifying implication becoming clear. And MW here must be Melissa Winters, he confirmed grimly. We need to check every one of these locations. The next morning, I took a personal day from court, my first since becoming a judge. I couldn't be directly involved in the investigation, but I needed space to process what was unfolding. I was sitting in my garden when the call came from Rick. We found them, Alex, he said without preamble. Patricia Bennett and Melissa Winters and 3 others. The world seemed to tilt beneath me. Dead? Yes. Each buried at the coordinates in that journal. I closed my eyes, grief for these women I'd never met washing over me. Was I? I couldn't finish the question. There were no coordinates with your initials, Rick said gently. Based on the pattern, it seems he only killed when there was significant resistance to his financial schemes or when they discovered his true identity. So I was lucky, I whispered. You were smarter than he expected, Rick corrected. You became a threat he chose to flee rather than eliminate. After we hung up, I sat motionless, watching butterflies drift through my garden. I had spent 10 years rebuilding my life, thinking I was recovering from betrayal and theft. Now I realized I had escaped something far worse. The preliminary hearing for Daniel's expanded charges was scheduled for the following week. This time, the fraud charges were the least of his concerns. Now he faced multiple murder charges across several jurisdictions. I wasn't in the courtroom, of course, but Eleanor Winters called me afterward. Thank you, she said, her voice steady despite the grief she must be feeling. They told me you were the reason they found Melissa. I'm so sorry about your daughter, I replied. At least now Jacob and I can have closure, she said, and Daniel will never hurt anyone else. The trial began 6 months later. By then, investigators had uncovered Daniel's entire history, a decades-long path of destruction that had left 5 women dead and countless others financially ruined. I followed the proceedings from afar, receiving updates from Rick and occasionally meeting with Eleanor, who had gained custody of her grandson. Jacob was a solemn child with his mother's eyes, slowly healing under his grandmother's care. When the jury delivered the verdict, guilty on all counts, I felt no triumph, only a quiet acknowledgement that justice had finally been served. The sentencing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. I had no intention of attending, but the night before, I received a letter that had been carefully screened by prison security. The handwriting was achingly familiar. Alexandra, tomorrow, they will sentence me to spend the rest of my life in prison. Before that happens, I offer you the one thing I never gave you, the truth. I never planned to kill you. You were different from the others, smarter, more independent, when you insisted on separate accounts for your law school funds. I knew you'd built yourself a safety net, however small. That's why I left when I did. What I took from you was money. What I took from the others was everything. The difference matters to me, even if it doesn't to you. I won't ask for forgiveness. We both know better than that. But I thought you deserved to know that of all the lives I've destroyed, yours is the only one I occasionally regret. Daniel. I read the letter twice, then placed it in an envelope addressed to Rick. It was additional evidence, nothing more. The morning of the sentencing, I surprised myself by driving to the courthouse. I didn't enter the courtroom, but watched the proceedings on the closed circuit feed in an empty jury room that a sympathetic clerk had arranged for me. Daniel looked older than his years now, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. As the judge read out his consecutive life sentences, ensuring he would never know freedom again, he showed no reaction. But when the victims' families began their impact statements, something in his posture changed. He didn't look at them, but his shoulders curved inward, as if finally feeling the weight of what he had done. Eleanor Winters was the last to speak, holding a photograph of Melissa. "My daughter believed in your love," she said, her voice unwavering. "Jacob will grow up knowing his mother's goodness, not your evil. You failed in every way that matters." When the proceedings ended and Daniel was led away, I quietly left the courthouse. Outside, spring rain washed the streets clean. I stood for a moment, letting the cool drops fall on my face, feeling as if a chapter had finally closed. That evening, I received a call from Chief Judge Marshall. "Alexandra, the federal prosecutor's office has reached out to me," he began. "They're forming a task force focused on serial financial predators, cases similar to Williams. They want a judicial advisor with specialized knowledge. I recommended you." I hesitated. "Working on cases similar to Daniel's would use your unique perspective to help others," he finished. "The experience you went through, terrible as it was, has given you insights few possess. Think about it." After we hung up, I walked to the window of my home office. On my desk sat a framed photograph, not of Daniel and me, but of the day I was sworn in as a judge. It showed me with my hand raised, eyes focused forward, stepping into a future I had built from the ashes of betrayal. 3 days later, I accepted the position with the task force. My first meeting included FBI agents, prosecutors, and financial crime specialists. As introductions went around the table, I stated my name and qualifications simply. When someone asked what drew me to this specialization, I answered with the truth. I believe that understanding how these crimes work is the first step to preventing them. "And to helping the survivors rebuild," added a woman across the table. She extended her hand. "Patricia Bennett, I worked in victim advocacy after my experience. The FBI thought I might offer a valuable perspective to the task force. I recognized her from the photograph in Eleanor's folder, the woman I'd felt a strange kinship with. Now I understood why. "Alexandra Harrington," I replied, shaking her hand. "I think we have a lot to talk about." Over the following months, our task force identified patterns that helped track potential predators before they disappeared with their victims' assets, or worse, with their lives. We developed financial education programs for vulnerable populations and created protocols to help law enforcement recognize the warning signs earlier. 1 year to the day after Daniel's sentencing, I received another unexpected call. Eleanor Winters was moving to be closer to her sister, and she wanted to say goodbye. We met at a park where Jacob, now 6, played on the swings while Eleanor and I talked. "He's starting to smile more," she said, watching him. "Children are so resilient." "They are," I agreed. "How are you doing?" "Some days are harder than others," she admitted. "But I'm focusing on Jacob now, and on helping other families through a support group I started." As we watched Jacob climb higher on the play structure, Eleanor turned to me. "You know, when I first came to your chambers, I was desperate for someone to believe me. I never imagined that meeting would change everything." "You changed everything," I corrected her. "Your persistence, your investigation. You laid the groundwork for bringing him to justice." She shook her head. "We both played our parts. And now we're both rebuilding." As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the strange path my life had taken. 10 years ago, betrayal had shattered my world and set me on a new course. That pain had transformed into purpose, leading me to a position where I could help others find justice and rebuild their lives. Daniel had taken so much from me and from others, but he hadn't taken our strength or our ability to create something meaningful from the wreckage he left behind. That night, I removed his letter from my desk drawer where I'd kept a copy. I read it one last time, then fed it into the shredder. His words, like his influence on my life, were finally reduced to nothing. Tomorrow, I would return to court as Judge Alexandra Harrington, not defined by what had been taken from me, but by what I had built in its place. A life dedicated to justice, to rebuilding, and to ensuring that predators like Daniel would find it increasingly difficult to prey on others. Some lessons came at a terrible price, but what mattered most was what we did with them afterward.